Episode 3. David and I were married for 15 years. 15 happy years, give or take the usual marital tiffs and disagreements. We enjoyed an increasingly comfortable life. David had made something of a success of being a city lawyer, and I pottered about in PR. We'd met at Bristol University, but not until the third year. Even though David and I were on the same course, I hadn't noticed him until then. One morning, though, I'd arrived late for a lecture, as usual, but instead of being able to slip quietly in the back as I normally did, I'd found the door at the top of the lecture theatre locked. It meant I had to emerge at the very bottom, in front of everyone, causing Professor Henderson to pause at his lectern. In my confusion, I dropped all my files, sending papers flying everywhere. When I'd finally picked them all up and taken a seat, crimson and mortified, the blonde boy beside me had scrawled on his pad, "Smooth." After exchanging some banter on the way out, me defending my position on the grounds that it offended no one if I was simply allowed to creep in as usual at the back. Him asking why I couldn't just get up 2 minutes earlier and save myself the hassle. We found ourselves going for coffee, and I remember, as I looked at his kind, intelligent face, his slightly sleepy grey eyes, wishing that I'd bothered to wash my hair. How long was it before we were going out? I don't remember. Not long, a few weeks, a month. Close proximity meant everything happened so quickly in those days. What I do remember, though, is that the fun and frivolity of the first 2 years dissipated somewhat. Finals loomed and we studied hard. Rather sweetly, we sat side by side in the library, usually writing the same essay, and because of that proximity I also knew, although I kept it to myself, because he wasn't good at being teased, that I was a bit cleverer than him. My marks were always higher, which I remember surprised him. When we left, however, he was the one who headed to the law conversion course and thence to the city and to a proper job. And I was the one who dithered, finally joining a fashion PR agency in the West End. I simply adored being in Covent Garden. I loved the fact that my girlfriends were nearby in similar PR or ad agencies, that the job itself was terrific fun, albeit badly paid. The shops were on my doorstep, and bars and restaurants a hop, skip and a jump away. On fine mornings, I'd even cycle across the river to my office in Henrietta Street, leaving first Lucy, then Minna, and then Nico with series of jolly Australian au pairs, although in the beginning I'd often had tears streaming down my face when I arrived. Which was easier to explain if I'd cycled, but not if I'd got the tube. Gradually it got easier, and when they were at school it was sheer bliss. I'd have hated to be at home all day, and David, I think, was rather proud, as most of the wives in Wandsworth had given up by then. Had stayed at home when more than one baby, certainly more than 2, had arrived. "I envy you," Caroline would wail as I bumped into her on my way to work when she was coming back from walking her youngest to school in her leggings. "What am I supposed to do now? My lot don't come out till 6 by the time they've done clubs. What am I supposed to do, polish teacups?" "You could always have an affair," I'd quipped. I cringe as I remember, and I do remember. I have a particularly vivid piece of footage in my mind of her throwing back her blonde head and roaring with laughter, because of course I'd been the one to do that, some years later, with her husband. Not an affair in the sense that we snuck off week after week to a hotel. That only happened once, and when we were very definitely at the end of our ropes. But an affair in the sense that we lost our hearts completely to one another, fell hopelessly in love, and Caroline was a good friend, not just a neighbour. Our children had grown up together. Lucy and Alice were close. I can barely tell you, barely admit it to myself, but I will. They were not immediate neighbours. They lived up the hill, where the bigger houses were. Theirs was a particularly beautiful wisteria-clad affair at the top, detached, almost in splendid isolation, with a glorious magnolia tree in the front garden. Henri was ruggedly handsome in the dark, tousled, twinkly-eyed, craggy-face vein. Not my type at all, in that I'd never really gone for the bleeding obvious, and he was also very flirty. Flirting was a way of life for him. He said it oiled the wheels, that everyday life would be dull without it, and he couldn't understand why Englishmen didn't do it. "Surely it's like breathing," he'd say. "Walking the dog. Don't you girls like it?" "We love it," we'd assured him one particular dinner party. "So why your husbands are so tight-assed about it? Why so, David? All that boarding school at 7, you think? Too emotionally crippled, peut-être?" He had an outrageous French accent. Not his fault, obviously, but sometimes we thought he hammed it up a bit. He certainly knew the English for perhaps. "Yes, we're too much the product of our upbringing to posture away like you, Henri, but frankly, if it keeps the girls smiling, we're all for it, eh, Jamie?" David turned to another husband. "Couldn't agree more," said Rosie's husband, who was quite drunk by then. "Henri," he raised his glass, "you have my unqualified permission to service my wife in the nicest possible way, as frequently and as passionately as you like. More power to you." Henri had roared, pulling me and Rosie close to him at the table, landing huge kisses on our cheeks. He was very tactile like that, lots of bear hugs and squeezing of shoulders. And if 2 of your fingers are moving mouth and throatwards, I can only tell you that he could also be terribly amusing and that all the husbands liked him. He was a terrific mimic and would have us in stitches, naughtily aping the idiosyncrasies of some of our more stuffy neighbours who felt they should be living in Chelsea and weekending in Gloucestershire, strutting around in yellow corduroy pants and barbers all weekend. He'd released Rosie and me and leapt up to give a particularly accurate impersonation of Tristan down the road, shoulders back, tummy proud, sweeping back a few wisps of hair and looking out of the corner of his eye to see who was watching. Henri, of course, wouldn't be seen dead in corduroys, yellow or otherwise, and wore crumpled shirts over skinny jeans. He always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, where he'd read another chapter of Christopher Hitchens, he probably had, before shuffling off for the paper, giving Tristan's wife, should he pass her in the street, a devastating smile, causing her to palpitate all day. Although Rosie and Sylvia and I laughed about this over coffee on my days off, we all privately agreed it probably wasn't a charade, that he probably was the most tremendous Lothario, particularly in Paris, where he frequently popped to and fro on business. "I don't know how Caroline puts up with him," Sylvia would say. "Even for a Frenchie, and don't forget I worked there. He's off the scale. If he doesn't already indulge in 5 à 7, he soon will, believe me." "5 à 7?" asked Rosie. "In France they start work early, well, 8ish, hardly dawn, break for a proper lunch, go back to the office till 5, when a Frenchman will call it a day and visit his mistress till 7. "Blimey," I mused. "They even have a set time for it?" Sylvia shrugged. "If you ask anyone now, they laugh and say, 'What rubbish, that went out ages ago.' But trust me, it still happens." "But Henri's not like that here, surely," Rosie objected. "Caroline would never put up with it." "No, no," we all agreed, frowning and shaking our heads, outwardly loyal to our friend. "Never." But wondering all the same. And we had no proof of even a flicker of infidelity. Nothing. And we all lived pretty much on top of one another. We probably know. And then ridiculously, and I know it wasn't just me, there was definitely an upping of our game around Henri. A sharpening of female wits, a flexing of argumentative muscle. He was clever, well-read, spoke 3 languages, but hey, so did Sylvia, who'd worked for Dior, and Rosie was no dunce either. "So, Henri, what do you think of Mitterrand's Balkan Treaty?" she'd toss at him as she went round to collect one of her brood. I was also very aware that we all scrubbed up when dropping the kids at Caroline's. Caroline. I shrank at her memory. A tall, willowy blonde with long legs, a ravishing smile, and a heart of gold. One of those rare people one suspects is beautiful on the inside as well as out. Sick child at school needs collecting? Caroline's your girl. No one around to let the dog out for a pee when you're trapped in a late meeting? She'd be on it. When David's parents had been killed in Phuket in that terrible Boxing Day tsunami, and we'd all completely gone to pieces, I'd find a lasagna or a chicken pie on my step most days. She was a brick. And those later days she worked too, helping Henri in his shop. Henri's shop was in Mount Street, in the heart of Mayfair, but he also had one in Paris on the Rue Dauphine, in possibly the smartest arrondissement, the 6th. I hope you're getting the picture. The Defoys were cool, smart, so smart that they didn't drip around in Chanel or drive Ferraris, charming couple, much chicer than the rest of us. I was small, dark, with a slightly beaky nose, gamine on a good day, usually in an old sweater and jeans, and sometimes a leather jacket. So why me? Why, when I went round to get Minna, did he break into a particularly winning smile, get to his feet, and hasten across the kitchen to kiss me 3 times, smile right into my eyes, and say, "Molly, you have come. I am so pleased. Have a drink, chérie? You'll join me in some Chablis?" And why, on that particular afternoon, did he insist I also play doubles with him the following Thursday? He'd booked a court to play Giles and Susie, mutual friends of ours, and Caroline couldn't make it. "Say you will," he demanded, both hands clasped to his heart. "Say now, or my whole week falls into decline." I laughed and promised not to so destroy his week, but he could have asked Rosie, who was a much better tennis player than I was, prettier too. "He obviously fancies you," Rosie said when I told her the following day. "I popped in later to get Max, and he hardly addressed a word to me." I grinned. "Well, it's just a game of tennis, no biggie." But I was a bit elated nonetheless. I cooked supper for the children that evening with a spring in my step, and even David noticed when he came home as he kissed me. "You're perky." Well, I had a lovely day with Rosie. We went to that new restaurant next to the bookshop for lunch. You'd like it. We thought we'd all go. And tennis was a blast that Thursday. Giles and Susie were good fun and good players, but by some small freak of the balls landing well on our side, we won. And crowed madly as the 4 of us had coffee and croissant in the sunshine. "You fluked it," complained Giles sulkily. "Au contraire, my friend, we've been practicing for months. That backhand of mine has taken years of honing, courtesy of my friend Andre Agassi, and Molly's secretly been slamming balls against her wall for ages." "You definitely fluked it, but we should do it again. It was fun. Let's do it every Thursday at 10. What do you say?" Giles was an ex-stockbroker, and he still had a way of firming things up. He also clearly wanted revenge. "Okay, we'll have a rematch, but trust me, we'll win. Molly's got some demon shots in her locker, haven't you, chérie?" I have, I agreed. Possibly even demonic. "Come on, every Thursday," persisted Giles. Laughing, we acquiesced, but even then I wondered if it was a good idea. I knew I liked Henri and was ridiculously flattered by this attention. I remember going home and saying to David that night, ever so casually, that I was going to play tennis with Giles and Henri and Susie on Thursdays, mixed doubles. "Oh, right." He looked surprised. "I thought you didn't like getting tied into anything regular." I didn't, on the whole. I shrugged. I thought it might just be good for me. Right. So who will you play with, Henri? Oh, I expect we'll swap around. We didn't, as I knew we wouldn't. Giles was fiercely competitive. It takes it so seriously. Henri gasped at me in astonishment as we sat alone in the sunshine at that same cafe. Giles and Susie having declined a coffee and gone on straight to their next assignment. The gym. It's a game, surely. Ah, but that's how come he's retired at 45, Henri, unlike us. I sipped my cappuccino. Yes, but unlike us, he does not know how to have fun, He looked at me with those twinkling brown eyes, meaning absolutely nothing, but perhaps absolutely everything. My girlfriends were agog at this new sporting development, but I played it cool. Oh, it forces me to get a bit of exercise, I explained. Anyway, as long as it doesn't become more energetic than you thought, Sylvia had joked, not thinking for one moment it was anything more than a jocular thing to say. No one imagined it was the beginning of anything. Did Henri? I don't know. Some months later, when I'd asked him in a restaurant in Paris, why me, he'd replied that he'd seen me as a challenge. It's just amusing to see a hitherto completely disinterested, even chilly woman. He cast me a look. Thaw. For a light to appear in her eyes, to sink. Ah, gotcha. Like a fish? Exactly. And did you never think you were playing with fire? I never expected to fall in love, if that's what you mean. Particularly with you, Molly. I knew he meant it. It was a backhanded compliment, so all the more sincere. He had fallen, as I had, and the coupling was most unlikely. I was a bit scruffy, as I mentioned, fancied myself as a bit edgy in my youth, with untamed locks and strange gear, a certain amount of attitude, perhaps even a sharp tongue. I certainly didn't suffer fools. I was the least likely woman on the planet to fall for a silver-tongued smoothie who wore cashmere sweaters slung artfully around his neck and handmade Italian shoes. And yet, here I was, 4 months after the first tennis match, at least a dozen more under our belts, on a business trip in Paris, just as he was too, having dinner and feeling out of control in a candlelit restaurant. And Caroline knew. Oh, but Henri is going to be there next week too. She turned in surprise in my kitchen. You can keep him company. He hates being out there alone. I'd paused, thinking, good heavens, I even had permission. And she was right not to suspect a thing, because nothing had happened. Yes, we'd ditched Giles and Susie for coffee after the second or third match, or they had us. But Caroline didn't think that was peculiar. Only David did. You mean it's just the two of you at Carluccio's every week? Isn't that a bit odd? Why not come straight home? What he meant was, I think it's a bit odd, but he was careful not to say it. He was pussyfooting around the idea that I might be attracted to Henri because it was too awful to contemplate. So awful it hadn't even occurred to Caroline. No one, no friend would even entertain the idea, surely. Except a glance through history tells us otherwise. This is no mitigation, but it sets out my stall, so I'll do it anyway. Every Thursday after tennis, I would tell myself that I would cancel next week's match. That the butterflies in my tummy and the quickening of my heart were too strong, too persistent. That it wasn't appropriate to be in such a constant state of riotous good humour. David must have wondered where that short-tempered, constantly stressed woman juggling work, children, and a home had gone. And who this good-tempered, well-dressed charmer was who'd replaced her. I don't think he got any further than that, though. I don't think men do. He wouldn't have thought, she's in love. Paris had not been planned, I swear. But when it fell into place, we'd looked at each other over our cappuccinos on the common and blanched. "The 16th?" Henri had said. "But that's when the shop is reopening. I'll be there all week." It had been closed for refurbishment for ages, so I couldn't have known. "Oh, right. I mean, I've got a meeting with Hermes." I wondered if I should get Jessica, my assistant, to go instead. I knew I was in trouble. "But I'll be very busy," he said quickly, seeing me hesitate. "I may not even see you." "Oh, right," I'd agreed happily, snatching at that, our smoke screen. And it had been what I'd said to Caroline in my kitchen. "Yes, I know," I'd said casually in response, "but he says he's going to be tied up and I've got wall-to-wall meetings." "Oh, he's so ridiculously precious. He's hardly going to be rushed off his feet. He's got Fabian there. He can meet you for lunch, if nothing else. I'll tell him. I wish I could come." "I wish you could come too," I said, almost meaning it. We had dinner, of course, not lunch. 3 nights on the trot, and it was heaven. Walking along the Seine, Paris at its prettiest, though when is it not pretty, even in the rain? Just at the beginning of summer, sitting outside restaurants as light faded over the pink and beige buildings, laughing and joking over our rosé. His knowledge of the best places to eat, the perfect menu, the only place with a secluded roof terrace, equally seductive. But he didn't seduce me. At least I didn't let him for the first 2 nights. Tuesday and Wednesday I went back to my hotel, where he kissed me chastely good night on both cheeks on the steps, both of us wanting like mad to push through the double doors and go upstairs, past the night porter, but resisting, not even voicing it. On the 3rd evening, just off the Boulevard Saint-Germain, he asked me over dinner if I'd ever been unfaithful, and I said no. I asked if he had, and he said no, and I believed him. He said it was too serious a thing to contemplate lightly, that his father had been a terrible rake, and that it had wrecked the family, which is why he only joked around with us girls in London. This, though, was not a joke. This was so serious, he thought he might burst with the portent of how he felt, how he didn't believe he'd felt for another human being. His eyes swam with tears. "Not even for Caroline before we got married." "Don't," I'd whispered, shocked, knowing this was the most dishonourable thing he could say, but knowing he spoke the truth, and that I felt it too. Knowing I'd felt nothing like this riot going on in my heart when I'd married David. Knowing I'd loved him, and it definitely felt like the right thing to do, but this was something different. What was I supposed to do with it, this fever? What were we supposed to do with it? That evening we did what seemed to us the only available thing. We paid the bill, walked silently through the Tuileries gardens to my hotel. No unbroken chatter as there had been on the previous nights. We went up the stone steps, pushed through the double doors, past the sleeping night porter to the lift. I remember thinking as the old-fashioned metal cage door concertinaed shut behind us, that there was no going back. Henri slid the door open on the 3rd floor, and we went down the corridor, hand in hand, to my room. I know for a fact from extensive research since that, for many husbands and wives, this would not be a life-changing event. They'd carry on as usual, as if nothing had happened, only a slightly larger smile playing on their lips, a jauntier spring in their step, betraying the reality. And I can't say I wasn't incredibly energized and overexcited by my few days away, too. But I was also a trifle breathless and permanently fearful. I'd flush scarlet whenever Henri's name was mentioned, even once dropping a chocolate soufflé on the kitchen floor. I wasn't very good at deception, and David wasn't stupid. "What's wrong with you? You're a bag of nerves recently." "I don't know, probably the time of the month," I'd said, but he wasn't fooled. We were very close, knew each other's rhythms and bodies intimately, and lately he must have been aware that I'd inadvertently been withdrawing mine, shying away from his touch when he hugged my shoulders, or staying up late to watch Newsnight or Question Time, and then coming to bed after he was asleep. "She's probably menopausal," offered Lucy, who at 14 thought she knew everything. "It sends them all a bit bonkers." We eventually had to go to supper at the Dufours because Caroline had rung back with a date when I wasn't there. David had answered and put it in the diary. So off we'd sallied one fine summer evening, my heart beating away, to our dear friend's house. The canopy of magnolia leaves under which we ducked nodded, it seemed, in a knowing manner as we went up the path. No doubt Caroline would create something magical and effortless, as she always did, and the rest of us, please let it be more than just the four of us, I thought as we waited on the step, would gasp and praise as something Middle Eastern and altogether more adventurous than anything I'd ever attempt arrived on a huge platter down the middle of the table. In their expansive kitchen, originals by Gillian Ayres and Rose Hilton decorating the walls, and as Caroline, in Chloe or something similar, wafted in the background, French windows open to the billowing garden, the air full of contented chatter and laughter. This was indeed the scene 1 hour later as, after closing the oven door, she joined the rest of us. Happily, Sylvia and Tim and Giles and Susie were there too, at the table, and we settled down to eat and to drink a delicious Margot, and I, placed opposite Henri, tried to be as normal as possible. This moment, incidentally, in the Dufour kitchen, one of many similar ones, sometimes appears freeze-framed in my mind as I feed the sheep in bitter winds or struggle under a sink to mend a leaking tap, as the pinnacle of the good life. The moment the scales, thus far finely balanced, became pivotal and tipped, not entirely in my favour. Although, of course, in reality, they tipped the moment I walked onto that tennis court with Henri. We managed some small talk, or at least Henri did, but I could barely look at him. Up until then, which was probably a month after Paris, we'd texted constantly, and of course played tennis, although every moment, every ball played, had felt different and highly charged. But we'd never had to do this, perform in public. And I don't count being with our tennis partners who were so introspective, so intent on consulting pace meters strapped to their wrists, they wouldn't have noticed if we'd kissed as we changed ends. This evening, however, Giles was more himself, more avuncular, the reason we all liked him. And then he ruined it all by telling us proudly that he'd swum and cycled for 3 hours that morning. "Why?" asked Henri. Giles blinked. "Why what?" "Why all this exercise?" "Oh, because it makes you feel so much better." Always the response, although we knew he meant look, having shed his paunch. "And I had a manicure," said Sylvia. "Can't tell you how much better I felt after that." Our mouths twitched. Giles gaped. "Are you seriously trying to tell me you think exercise is some sort of vanity?" "Well, it's certainly self-indulgent," said David. "You're pleasing no one but yourself." "Yes, but the effort's phenomenal." "You're being teased, my love. It's the trumpeting of your achievements, not the doing of them, that amuses them, as if it's something to be proud of." "It is. While you were asleep, I slipped in 50 lengths. "Not to my knowledge you didn't," purred his wife. "Or if you did, I slept through it." We all shrieked with laughter, including Giles. "But that's surely the point, isn't it?" insisted Henri, leaning in intently. "You could have been having a lovely time making love to Susie and going out for breakfast afterwards in the sunshine, reading the papers and strolling through the park, enjoying life." At this juncture, I slipped away to the loo because this was what we had done in Paris. the morning after the fateful night. We'd strolled beside the Seine, shamelessly arm in arm, stopped for breakfast at Les Deux Magots, where Henri had read Le Monde and I'd flipped through Paris Match. Then we'd headed for the Luxembourg Gardens, behind the Sorbonne, and spent the morning lying on the grass, kissing and gazing up at the sky like a couple of teenagers. Had it just been a figure of speech, or had he said it deliberately to force the issue? Because there was no doubt Paris was not a one-off for Henri. He wanted to see a lot more of me, longed for me, his text repeatedly said. Did he want more than an affair? No, of course not. We'd only slept together once. But he definitely loved me, had told me so. I hadn't responded accordingly in the park when he'd said it. It was too potent, too incendiary. Well, we're in love. Eyes blazing defiantly at our respective spouses, Caroline and David, as if that negated everything else. Was that what I wanted? Two men were silent and watchful, and before I sat down I caught eyes of both of them, Henri and David. When we walked home, David was silent. He didn't say anything until we let the babysitter go. I made to go upstairs, but David was in the kitchen doorway. His face was drawn. Well? He asked. My mouth dried. Well, what? You know. Something's going on, Molly. I've known for weeks now, especially since you came back from Paris. You haven't been near me, haven't let me touch you. And Henri was out there too. There didn't seem any way out. That's my only excuse for hurting him. I couldn't deny any of the things he'd just said. And a tiny bit of me, Lord knows which subversive bit, wanted to tell him because it was so huge and I couldn't carry it around with me any longer. I'm told this is not normal behavior, but then I've also been told I'm not classic affair material. Certainly at that moment I felt the admission would be better than the terrible fear of constantly feeling I'd be found out, that it would be a relief. It wasn't, of course, it was dreadful. David's gentle face was agony to watch as it contorted with the pain of something he knew but didn't want to have confirmed. He put his hand out to the doorframe, had to physically steady himself. Henri, you slept with Henri. You actually went to bed with him. Yes, I whispered as the horror dawned on me as well. Not that it hadn't already, but David's articulation of it rendered it startlingly vivid and toxic. My friend, our friend, the children's friend's father. He could not believe it, even though, as he said, he'd known or feared. And why should he? It was cataclysmic. He went past me and sat on the stool at the island which somehow his legs had taken him to. I turned to look. His back was to me, hunched. Do you love him? He managed. No, I said, knowing this was true, that I was undecided, which made it no, surely. And he? He says he is. He would. He turned to look at me, his eyes hardening. Why, Molly? He gazed at me aghast. Why throw a grenade like this into our lives? You've ruined everything. Don't you know that? And you don't even love him. For what? Are you stupid? I don't know. Infatuation, I suppose. Jeez, it sounds so childish. You mean flattery, he said bitterly. We all joke about it, you girls flirting with him. But to be taken in... No, I wasn't taken in. It wasn't like that. It was much more than that, David. How much more? He said with venom. I'm just saying... I knew I had to be careful. I wasn't a vulnerable idiot, and I resisted. I resisted, David. Bully for you, he roared. What I mean is I didn't just... Roll over and spread your legs. David! Mum? A voice called sleepily from the top of the stairs. We froze, appalled. I swallowed. Coming, Lucy? As I left, he sprang up and held my wrist. Shame on you, Molly, he breathed, his eyes burning into mine. His hand on my arm was trembling. His eyes then went deliberately to the stairs and the direction of our child's voice. Shame on you. The next few weeks were something of a blur. I walked around as if I'd suffered a bereavement. I had in a way. I'd lost David's love. And I hadn't realized, you see, how terrible that would be. But I also, and I'm ashamed to say this, longed for Henri. The sorrow of the demise of our hitherto happy marriage didn't, I'm afraid, quell or even diminish that feeling. I had to text him and tell him, of course. Couldn't chance David bumping into him in the street. There was a pause, a hiatus of at least 10 minutes. My hands were palsied as I waited. Naturally, he'd be appalled. Who wouldn't? I'd broken a cardinal rule. Not that we'd made any. The text finally arrived. It said, "It changes nothing." I pressed it to my heart, knew that I loved him, knew I'd been honest when I'd said no to David, but knew now that I did. David wouldn't confront him, I realized that. He wouldn't do it to Caroline. So I just had to be patient and see what he would do. I didn't have to wait long. About 3 weeks or so. Meanwhile, I made myself extremely busy at work, taking on more than I would normally, including a trip to Milan to cover the autumn collections, and one to New York, mostly to avoid seeing Caroline. When I returned with my case from Heathrow, David was waiting for me in the kitchen, the children at a friend's house. "I've put the house on the market," he said. "Savills reckon it'll go very quickly." I sat down carefully on a stool at the island. "We can't live here anymore, you've seen to that. And I don't want a divorce. I love the children too much to do that to them." "So do I breathed. And yet I still wanted Henri, but a divorce? No, unthinkable. "I've seen a house with a bit of land, quite a lot of land, in fact, in Herefordshire. It needs some work, but it'll be a project. And I can work in Ludlow. There's a firm of lawyers who advertised in the Gazette for a trademark lawyer. I can do it standing on my head. It'll be a new start." I nodded. This was non-negotiable, I could tell. "What about my work?" "As I say, the house will be a project." Or we can stay and you can leave this house and set up with Henri, perhaps on the other side of London. My mouth felt sticky, drained of saliva. "No," I whispered, we'll go to Herefordshire." He nodded, if not pleased, then relieved at least. "But David, if we go, if we make a new life together, and if I don't leave, well, you have to forgive me." He held my gaze across the kitchen. "Yes, I realize that." "Otherwise it'll be unbearable." I know." We managed to smile at one another, not to hug, not yet, but we would, in the fullness of time. I think we both knew, though, in that sad exchange of smiles, that things would never be the same again. I'd seen to that. The house did indeed go quickly, within 3 days of being put on the market, and to sealed bids, which was exciting and a distraction. At one point, as David put the phone down to the estate agent, we squealed with delight, forgetting ourselves. Then we remembered, and it was back to business as usual. Quite a lot of money went toward paying off the mortgage, which was huge. We'd overstretched ourselves, but the rest we put on a deposit on the house in Herefordshire, which she took me to see, even though I knew my opinion mattered little. It was a fait accompli. To be honest, I was faintly appalled. I mean, the house was large and rambling, too rambling, with third-story attic rooms which were damp, with crumbling sash windows, and from which, when I wrenched one open, I could see only a vast, empty landscape. "As far as the eye can see," said David proudly, joining me at the open window. "You're kidding. That's not a small holding, that's a farm. Who's going to run it?" "I will, of course. We'll have sheep. They're terribly easy to manage, nothing to it." Famous last words. The next few weeks were a blur of packing up and finding schools after the summer for the children, who were by turns aghast, horrified, and appalled at leaving their friends, but David swept it all aside. "But don't they mind leaving?" Sylvia had asked, astonished, as all our friends were. "They'll do as I say," replied David, and they did, because they respected him and he was always firm, but they trusted him. He was a very good father. Anyway, as I say, the weeks flashed by, and within a twinkling we were gone, or were going, the removal men having advanced ahead of us that morning. David and the children and I were poised now in the road to say goodbye to our friends, Sylvia and Tim, Rosie and Jamie, Giles and Susie, and, of course, Henri and Caroline. Caroline I hugged first to get it over with, feeling like Brutus, but Henri came last, his heart beating against mine as he held me tightly, but briefly. "Never goodbye," he said fiercely in my ear. I couldn't reply, was shocked he'd even dared to say this with David's eagle eye upon us. Was Caroline watching us too? Her face a little paler than usual? Smile a bit tighter? At any rate, I hopped in the car, and in moments we were off, with promises to come back soon and cries that they were all to come and see us, the whole lot of them, to come and stay. We had so much room. All the children, too, the children who, as we purred down the familiar tree-lined street that I loved, ran along behind us as David beeped the horn and our children waved and hung out of the windows, shouting their goodbyes. Minutes later we rounded the corner, then another onto the main road, and fell silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror and caught Lucy's eye. She gave me a hard look, then turned away. I had, of course, wondered how much she'd heard that night, but it occurred to me now that it was more than I'd hoped. Fortunately, children adapt very quickly, and we were lucky in that the weather was kind and Herefordshire shone for us. We'd thrown money at the removal firm, so they moved us in seamlessly. We flung open all the creaking French windows and lived in the garden, picnicking and barbecuing. David on top form, waving the tongs with excited chatter about maybe a pool. Certainly the old grass tennis court could be mown and remarked, and a trampoline. We had so much space. And despite their initial resistance, I could see the children reveling in it, exploring, running down the grassy bank to the river which snaked through the valley. Certainly the younger two, and even Lucy, who'd been withdrawn when we arrived, seemed to thaw. She and I spent hours in the garden, which she loved, but which left me cold. But if she was out there digging and weeding and exclaiming at a new flower she'd found, I would be too, beside her, with David I knew passing by with a wheelbarrow, looking on approvingly. I felt like I was being a good girl, trying really hard and behaving well. I wasn't a country girl at heart, had been brought up in suburban Andover, where my most rural pursuit had been to learn to ride. But I could adapt. I admired the 60-odd sheep we seemed to have acquired from the old owners, fed the ducks, who I quite liked, the chickens, who scared me with their flutterings and peckings, gardened with Lucy, played endlessly with the other two, helping with dens and camps, praised David for being so clever in finding this place. And we even made love for the first time in, well, a while. And it was fine, really fine. David would probably say it was terrific. He bounced around the house and even hummed to the radio because, although I knew a lot of him was still furious with me, he was so enamored with his new life, the one he'd always dreamed of. He forgot to be cross. My heart ached, though, Of course, the farmhouse was lovely, but it was David's dream, not mine. It was so remote, this valley of ours. The nearest house was 1/2 mile away, another farm. We weren't even on the edge of a village, which, when we'd vaguely discussed it years ago, he'd promised me. But he hadn't had to keep any promises, had he? And I loved people. Wondered if I'd survive without them, without my lovely girlfriends, my job, the comrades I had at work, the noise, the bustle, the being aliveness of London. More than anything else, though, I missed Henri. I'd written to him before I left saying this break had to be permanent, final, that I owed it to David. No more texting after the 16th of July. No emails, nothing. He'd written back saying he respected that, and although it would drive him insane, he'd do his best. My heart longed for him, though, my funny French friend, who made me laugh more than anyone else, whose lightness of soul was so different to David's quiet thoughtfulness, whose joie de vivre just elevated my spirits. It was with terror that I felt them collapse now. And then he contacted me at about this time of plummeting mood, as I wondered how to rally, felt almost breathless with the effort of contemplating making yet another victorious sponge with Minna, followed by a trip to the village fete. He sent me a text. I can't do this. I miss you so much. You became my life, my spirit. Can I just talk to you? Can I ring you in 1/2 hour? I felt euphoria flood through me, almost knocking me off my feet. I was at the kitchen sink at the time, looking out to where David was overseeing a bonfire with the children, letting them throw branches on it, keeping a weather eye as they pranced about. This should have been the moment to text back and say, no, absolutely not. No kiss. Instead, saliva evaporating in my mouth, I texted back, yes, I miss you so much too. Kiss, kiss. My breathing became desperately shallow, but I set about making the Victoria sponge. When it was in the oven, I went outside. David was on his own now, the children having drifted off to the tennis court. Darling, could you pop to the shops? I've got a cake in the oven, and I've just realised there's nothing for lunch. He looked irritated. I've just started a bonfire. Well, I can watch that from the window. He frowned. Fires were man's work. Can't we just have omelettes? The chickens are laying like smoke. We need to eat our produce, Molly. Something sanctimonious about this annoyed me, plus my emotions were on a knife edge. We do eat our frigging produce. Every day I pull up asparagus or new potatoes or runner beans, and the children are up to here with eggs. Just occasionally I'd like some mozzarella, basil and a few lentils. Is that all right? London food. Yes, okay, but we don't have to be so purist, such exponents of the good life, that we become prigs, do we? Can't we just be ourselves? Can't I be myself? Oh, for pity's sake, Molly, stop turning everything into such a ridiculous drama. Me? I just came out and asked you to go to the frigging shops. It was the first time we'd had a row in weeks, since Paris, because David didn't argue. He kept it all in. This was big for him. It was one of those carefully connected fuses that had popped out. Right, he said, seething. I'll go to the bloody shops because if Molly wants something, Molly must have it. That's so unfair, I stormed as he stalked past me through the back door into the kitchen, snatching up his keys on the dresser, heading to the front drive and his car. I heard the engine rev loudly, a noisy crunch of gravel, then he roared off down the lane. I stood for a moment fuming, irritated that my moment of pleasure, my first for weeks, had been spoiled. Then I felt ashamed, but not for long. I glanced at my watch. 10 to 12. 5 minutes. Tennis would occupy the children for a while. I turned and hastened inside, pulling my phone out of my jeans pocket, checking it was charged. Up in my bedroom, he rang, and we talked, and it was heaven just to hear his voice again. We didn't talk for long because Tatiana, his youngest, suddenly appeared from a piano lesson. So we quickly signed off, telling each other this couldn't happen again, but knowing it would. That it was the thin edge of the wedge. That we were pretending. I pocketed my phone, feeling lighter, as if my feet could leave the floor. I went to the window, threw it wide, and breathed in deeply and exhaled. As I raised my face to the heavens, I mouthed, "Thank you, God." It was at that point that I heard the sirens, the wail in the distance which got louder as a police car flashed past my yard at the front of the house. It was followed swiftly by another vehicle, an ambulance this time. Half an hour later, I would see another police car when I was in the back garden poking the fire. I'd spot it through the French windows, parked in the yard. 2 policemen would come around the side of the house and approach me at the bonfire. The older one would remove his hat, twist it nervously in his hands, and tell me David was dead.